We're going to do a series on the book of Genesis, and I was asked, haven't you taught that a series on Genesis before? Here, more than once I have. Why would I do it again? Does everybody here know everything you need to know about the book of Genesis? No. Let me ask you this. How many times have you heard an Easter message? All of you different, depending on how old you are. And you heard another one this year, and you're going to hear one next year, and we hear it over and over again because we need to hear it, and it's material we need to go through. But this time with the book of Genesis, I'm approaching it a little bit differently, and I hope you notice if you remember the last time I taught it. If you don't, it's fresh this time, but from a little different angle. And we have it, the book of beginnings, because that's the beginning of all things. Who wrote the book of Genesis? Who do we think, what's traditionally the thought of who wrote the book of Genesis? Moses. The first 5 books are said to be written by Moses. Now, the last part of Deuteronomy he didn't write because he was dead. So somebody else filled in after him, but he didn't write that much of it. But it's traditionally thought for different things that are said in the Old Testament as well as in the New Testament that leads us to believe that Moses was the one that wrote this, and I kind of feel like he was. And so, but you think about that, how many years that was after the creation, after the things that he's writing about in the book of Genesis, how many years past that it was. And think about how the world had deteriorated from the time of the Garden of Eden and Adam and Eve down to the time when Moses was in the land of Egypt. Things had changed considerably over that period of time. So anyway, we're going to be starting back with the book of beginnings, and I want to start with the first verse because it's a good place to start. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And this is a quote. This verse asserted for the first time in history that there was one God, that this God is universal as opposed to tribal, and that God is not within nature but is the sole creator, unlike every other God in history. And you can go back and look at any God you want to that they had, and ones that the different deities that they worshipped, and you will find that to be true. There was not a single nation, a single writing from any civilization that I know of that had one God that was the creator of all things, that was outside of nature. All of their gods were very much human, and they were caught up in a lot of things that were just incestuous relationships as well as many other things, but it gives a story of how they came about. But this verse of Scripture, when this was written, it says, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. That's the first time in history, and pretty much the only time in history, when you have one God that's outside of nature. If the universe is created, that in itself implies purpose. Now, I have a quote here by Richard Dawkins that says, DNA neither cares nor knows. DNA just is, and we dance to its music. And so I put purpose or chance. So what does he believe? He's an evolutionist. He's an atheist. So he believes everything happened by chance. There's no purpose to anything at all. It's all by chance. Here's another quote of his. The problem, now think about this a little bit from his standpoint. The problem I hope scientists will have solved by the end of the 21st century, thinking more academically, the problem of human consciousness. Do we have any trouble understanding human consciousness? But atheists would, because you have to account for human consciousness, you have to account for matter, you have to account for energy, and you have to account for that some way, and they have found no way to do so as of yet. But we do, because we're made in the image of God. So, back to where I started. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So again, this is the first time that's ever been stated in any historical documentation. That was very radical for that day, because that was like 3,000 or 4,000 years ago when this was written. This verse was written thousands of years ago. The truth has not changed, nor have its implications. Purpose is implicit in God created. So we can see a purpose in life. We can see a purpose in our lives and other people's lives because we were created from a God with purpose. He had a reason for doing what he did, and so it helps us understand, or helps me to understand, that there's a purpose in life, and there's a purpose for all of us here on this earth, because God, with intention, created us. If we came about by chance, there would be no purpose. There would be nothing to give us purpose except what we decided ourselves, and that would be a horrible place to live. Created, the Hebrew word is bara, implies nothing pre-existed. Genesis 1:1. When he says God created, there's nothing that preceded that. And you see the note I put down here, when it's used, if you look up that particular Hebrew word, when it's used in the Old Testament, it always has to do with God. So he's the only one that could create something from nothing. That's one of the biggest arguments to me against atheism, and it is the fact that how do you get the first matter? How do you get the first energy? How do you get the first intellect? How do you get the first consciousness? How does all that just come about by chance? Where's your starting point? In the beginning, God. God was in the beginning and thus not created. Other gods were given a creation story as to how they became to be. What does Genesis tell us about where God came from? What does it tell us? It says, in the beginning, God. That's all it said. It doesn't tell us anything else. Why does God not tell us where God came from or how he came to be? Because he's not like the rest of creation. He's not like us. He doesn't have a beginning and an end. He's outside of nature. And being outside of nature, being outside of being a spiritual being, I guess is the best way to put it. Put it a different way. How far out does space go? Where does space end? Can you get your mind? So when people are thinking about when I was a kid, how kids get, I'm thinking, how can you live forever? Do you live because everything I knew had a beginning and an end. I said, is it kind of like you live in a circle? You kind of going around and around. Is that what you do? Now, this is a kid's thinking, but really that's a hard concept for us to get our minds around, as an eternal being like God, and a never-ending time and a never-ending space, because everything we have in our lives is a beginning and an end. We know that we can, if we leave here and head due east, and we can travel across water and everything else, sooner or later we'll wind up right back here. We won't go out into space or anywhere else. We'll be right here. So everything is limitless. When it comes to God, there's limitless, and so he doesn't have any origin. He doesn't have to have an origin story. And then this, did man create God or did God create man? And this fellow here, which I guess his name's Apoku Quating. Does that sound good? Am I close enough? Of the Science Leadership Academy. It's his quote. While God is a reflection of man, so he's saying God's a reflection of man, the Bible is a reflection of the time when it was originally written. Due to that time period, there are numerous principles stated in the Bible that would seem absurd if they were ever brought up in modern times. Okay? Not like evolution or any of that sounds absurd, but it would be absurd. The main examples of this are found in Bible verses that could be labeled as sexist. For example, 1 Timothy 2:11, it is said, I permit no woman to teach or have authority over man. This verse is clearly a reflection of a time when the Bible was written, a time when women were below men and were seen as nothing more than an object of sex. Is that true about the Bible? First thing is, he takes a verse of Scripture out of context. We're not going to discuss that verse of Scripture because that's not what we're here for. We'll do it sometime if you want to. But he takes a verse of Scripture out of context. So he's not even using the parameters within which this was written. And then he says, at a time when women were below men and as seen as nothing. Is that true? And what I used to help make the point was Proverbs 31. This is just a small portion of Proverbs 31. 13, it says, she selects wool and flax and works with her willing hands. She is like the merchant ships bringing her food from far away. She rises while it is still night and provides food for her household and portions for her female servants. She evaluates the field and buys it. She plants a vineyard with her earnings. She draws on her strength and reveals that her arms are strong. She sees that her profits are good, and her lamp never goes out at night. Does that sound like somebody that's considered low in society? This sounds like a pretty powerful woman to me. All different kind of things it mentions about her. So women in the Bible, contrary to what many people think, even Christians, even New Testament and Old Testament alike, does not put women on a lower level than men. There's a place that women hold and a place that men hold, and it comes from what we'll be studying in the 3rd chapter of the book of Genesis when we get there, and which we're not getting that far tonight. And so, are there any problems with what he has to say? Yes. And I just told you what they were, that he misquotes and so on. So, let's go back to Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness covered the surface of the watery depths, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the surface of the waters. Then God said, let there be light, and there was light. God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and he called the darkness night. Now, verse 2 there it says, now the earth was formless and empty. And King James says, without form and void. So that's the way I try to read it every time I'm reading it something else. In NIV, the New International Version, says formless and empty. The NASB says formless and desolate emptiness. So it said God created the heavens and the earth was without form and void. For how long? Before the next verse when it says God said, let there be light. The Bible doesn't tell us. Why doesn't it tell us? It's not important to what he's trying to tell. He's laying down the basics of what God created and where man came from, and is establishing who is man in relation to God. So it has no reason at all for him to say, well, he created the heavens and the earth, and about 15 billion years later, he said, let there be light, or one day later, or the next day, and people argue that, but even Christians, so we're not. It could be said that God not only was, in Genesis as you read this, keep in mind, it's not just the creation story, which it is, it's a creation story, but throughout the Bible you can see God creates order out of chaos. And you can see that throughout the Bible in what he did. And it says the earth was without form and void, and he said, God said, let there be light. So he takes chaos and he starts putting it into order, into an ordered form. It could be said, I just encapsulate where we are. Could be said that the most important verse in the Bible is Genesis 1:1. This verse changed history. How? The verse posits a creator of the universe, and that gives meaning to existence. The word created implies nothing pre-existed. Everything, with the exception of God, has a beginning. Fourth thing, for the first time, a creation story has but one creator. Unlike pre-Bible creation stories, there is complete silence regarding the birth of the deity. For the first time in history, we are presented with a God who is separate from nature. And for the first time in history, the creator and the act of creation is not physical. God is the maker of order and distinctions. So keep this in mind. He brings order out of chaos. And also, throughout the Bible, you can see order and distinction. And that, if we think with those concepts in mind, it helps us to sort through what he's doing in creation and how he lines up creation and different things. For instance, he has light and darkness, day and night, land and water, humans and animals, man and woman, life and death. So each one, he has distinctions between each kind. Where are we running into a problem with that in today's society? That goes against this horribly. It's the transgender thinking. Because you ask somebody who believes in this, you say, well, are you a woman? They say, well, yes, I'm a woman. Well, are you a woman or are you not a woman? Well, I'm a woman. Well, what is a woman? Well, a woman it's somebody, it's where you think, it's how you feel, and they go through all these different things. You say, well, now you're saying that you were a man and you went through all the treatments and everything else and you became a woman, and you say you're a real woman. They say, yes. You say, well, what is a woman? If I say, what is a chicken? Can you tell me what a chicken is? Yes, you can define it. Pretty simple. Well, how can you be something if you don't even know what that something is? And that's what we're talking about with this in distinctions. God creates distinctions and separation between different. There's a separation between us and animals, a big separation. The evolutionists say that we're just animals like everything else. But when you look at the most intelligent animal compared to some of the slowest humans, even an infant has a 1-year-old human is smarter than your smartest animal, so far as what they can do, how they can reason, and so on. Now, some people argue with that, but waste of time. 2b, the second part of that, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the surface of the waters. It seems here, I put a note here, that the focus before was outside. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void. And then, at this particular point, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the surface of the water. Now it seems if the focus has shifted from outside of creation to within creation. Verse 3. Then God said, let there be light, and there was light. What did he have to do to get light? He said, let there be light, and there was light. Where do you get the materials? He said, let there be, and there was. After the first verse, when God created, bara, the word created, from there up until you get to man, you'll notice it doesn't say, and God created this, and God created this. He says something like, let there be, and there was, let there be, and there was, so on. There's only one exception, but we won't go into the exception. But he doesn't say that, use the word bara, created again until he gets to man. And I think there's a reason for that. Verse 31, God saw that all he had made, and it was very good. Evening came, then morning, the sixth day. Okay. I want to cover this quickly because it's an argument within the scientific world and the Christian world, within Christians, within the Christian world. How old is the earth? How long was creation? Was creation 6 literal days, or was creation 6 periods of time? Which one was it? Well, that's a good question, because the word for day that they use here is yom. And if you look at the definition, I put the definition up here. If you can see it, it means more than just day. It can be a specific day, morning and evening, or actually evening and morning is more the Jewish way of looking at it, is a day. Instead of looking at it like that, it can be period of time. It can be several different things. So it doesn't necessarily pin us down to one particular definition for Yom. And the reason I think this is important is because Christians get in fights with each other about this very thing. Do I know which one it was? I have no idea. I was not there when God created, and He didn't tell me. So I can't tell you for sure. They say, well, if it's morning and evening, then it was a 24-hour day. Was God talking about 24-hour days? If you'll notice as we go through the first chapter of the book of Genesis, it says, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth was without form and void. God said, let there be light, and there was light. When did He create the sun and the moon? The fourth day. So what determined the length of a day on day one that we're talking about here? I don't know. But there's organization Answers in Genesis, and I've read a lot of their material. I like their material. Everyone that had the Ark Encounter up in Cincinnati, they do a lot of good works. But Ken Ham, who started the organization, he says if you don't believe that if it's 6 literal days, then you can't believe the rest of the Bible. He is incorrect. Is all I can tell you. I do not agree with him on that at all, because could God have created this in each one of these in a 24-hour period of time? Yes. He could have created man in a split second. He could have created anything He wanted to in a split second, or He could have used thousands of years. He could have used millions of years. Here's my point. I don't care. It doesn't matter. It's irrelevant to the fact. What's important is it says, in the beginning, God. In the beginning, God. We get past that, we get into conjecture, and we get into fights where we don't need them to be. And that's what I put here, whether literal days or not. Genesis 1:26. Then God said, let us make man in our image according to our likeness. They will rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, and the livestock, all the earth, and the creatures that crawl on the earth. So God created man in His own image. He created him in the image of God. He created them male and female. So, this is the first time He gets back to using the phrase, or Moses gets back, which I think is Moses, gets back to using the phrase, God created. The other things came to be, but He says God created. Who did He create man in the image of? Who is our? Now we can get some discussion among Christians when we get there. Now let me just give you, I'm going to throw this out, because I'm not saying this is true. I have no idea. Just ask a question. If you were to look into heaven, who's there? What kind of creatures are there? What kind of beings are there? What kind of beings are in heaven? What kind of beings were in heaven when God created the heavens and the earth? Okay, we have angels. Angels are created beings by God. Have you read some of the creatures that it describes as being in heaven? Having 6 wings, having a head that looks like a bear, or having a head that looks like a... Some of these things would scare you if they came in your house. But these are in heaven. So what all kind of different forms was inhabiting heaven at the time of creation? We don't know. Many Christians, and I would say probably most Christians, say this was talking about the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Don't tell anybody outside of here, but I don't think that's what He's talking about. But He said, let us make man in our own image. If you look at the word used for God here in the first chapter of the book of Genesis, it's Elohim, which is it's a plural form. I won't get past that. It's the plural form. So when we're talking about we create him in our image. We're going to create man in our image. Then what does it say in that last part? Male and female created He them. So which one's created in the image of God? Male or female? And the answer is yes. Both of them are. Now, how could that be? He said, let's create man in our own image. Okay. I'm not going to beat that any further for just a minute. Then we'll skip down to the second chapter of Genesis, 7th verse. Then the Lord formed a man out of the dust from the ground and breathed the breath of life into his nostrils, and the man became a living being. And dust that it says here, you can see the definition, dust, clay, earth, mud. In other words, he made man out of dirt. Why would he do that? And here's another question. I think I might have this. Some people say, and especially people that don't want to believe the Bible, they say you have one creation story in the first chapter and then have a second creation story in the second chapter, and they contradict each other because the first chapter talks about creating all the animals and everything, and then creates man last. And in the second chapter it says God created man. He said it has this, and then it says, and God created all the animals and he brought them before man, and man named them and all this kind of stuff. Is that contradicting? No. What we have is we have the creation story here in the first chapter, and then we have the second chapter focused and in particular on man, more so than anything else. And he made him out of dirt. So why did he make him out of dirt? This summarizes just what I just said, so we won't get too carried away with it. What did chapter 1 posit about man's place and purpose on this earth? What did it say about man's purpose on this earth? What did it say about man's place on this earth in relation to everything else? Because that's important. He said, God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful, multiply. All the animals are fruitful and multiply. There's nothing different. Fill the earth. There, do that. Subdue it and rule. There's where the difference comes in. There it gives you for the position, the place of man on this planet from the very beginning. Man was to be, and I like to say it like this, and some Christians get upset with me for this, that God created man to be the God of this world. And some people, that sounds blasphemous. Who does Paul say the God of this world is right now? Satan. Well, if he says the God of this world is Satan, why is it blasphemous for me to say that God created man to be the God of this world? He created man to be the ruler of this world. He put him in a place. He established a purpose for man, created man for a purpose, and he put him in a garden and created a Garden of Eden for him, a perfect place for him. And so that means that man's going to be content from there on out. Everything's going to be fine with Adam and Eve. We'll have no troubles. 2:7, then the Lord God formed man from the dust of the ground and breathed the breath of life into his nostrils, and the man became a living being. It says, and the man became a living being. So he makes man out of dirt, and sometimes if when you look at it, if you're not careful, we can get the wrong imagery. It's not like God came in here and got him a little bit of dirt and some water and kind of formed them all together and then blew him up like a balloon. But that's the way we look at it a lot of times. What did he breathe into man? He breathed life. It breathed life. Whose life? His life. So what's the difference between... You notice he didn't do that with any of the animals. He didn't say we breathed into the whales the breath of life, breathed into the lions the breath of life. Breathe into the only one to breathe. So man is set apart as different. He's supposed to subdue and rule. That's his authority here. He's been given authority here, and he's created a different kind of being because he has a physical body that was made out of this earth, and he has a spirit that's breathed into him. And he's a different type of being. So he has a connection, and I've probably written this down here somewhere. We'll see in a minute. Skip that part. Chapter 1 had already given the sequence in which God created the heavens and the earth. The chapter 2 does not need to rehash this. I forgot to put 2 in there. Rehash this. Instead, chapter 2 focuses on man and his place on this earth. So what in chapter 2 it was very little written about man in the first chapter, except the fact that he created man, he created them in his image, and he told them to subdue the earth. And now he's going into more specifics, and that's what he does here. He's focusing more on man than he is on the rest of creation. And you can see that from the thing it says. Then the Lord formed man of the dust of the ground and breathed into him the breath of life in his nostrils, and the man became a living being, the breath of life. And I put the breath and life, the Hebrew word that's used for those, and breath can be breath, it can be inspiration, intellect, it can be soul, spirit, it can mean any of those things. And it can mean all of those things of life, and then in general it's life. So he breathed into him the breath of life. To me, what he's saying is he's created him, because he said that we created man in our image. Didn't create dogs, chickens, cats, and all this kind of stuff in our image. Created man in our image. And what kind of being is God? He's a spirit being. Well, if he's a spirit being, you're creating his image, then you have to be a spirit being. And this had the same thing, except I'm not good at Hebrew, so I'm not going to try it. But just so you know. And I have decided to put this little tidbit in here. Man was formed from the elements of this earth. 99% of the mass of the human body consists of 6 elements: oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, calcium, and phosphorus. They are worth about $576. All the other elements taken together are worth only about $9. So, is man only worth $585? There's some that I don't think are worth $500, but we better get away from that. But is man only worth $585? So what was the principle? What was the purpose? Why did God it said he formed him out of the dust of the earth, out of the materials that's here, out of this oxygen, out of this carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, calcium, phosphorus. He took all of these things together and he formed them together. What happens to any kind of creature on this earth when this creature dies and the breath leaves their body? If you leave that alone, regardless of what it is, it begins to decay, and what it's become again? It becomes all that stuff, becomes part of it. So God used all that to create him. What gives humans their worth then? If the material that I'm made out of is only worth $585, and that's it, that's on the top side. I'm worth $585. What gives us our worth? Man was formed out of the materials of this earth, and then God breathed into him the breath of life. He breathed into him the Spirit. He became a spirit being like God. What gave him his worth was he's made in the image of God. Not the dirt, not the phosphorus, not all the stuff. That's not what gave him his worth. It's because he's made in the image of God. Why was it important for him to make him out of the elements of this earth and then to breathe in him the breath of life? Why couldn't he just said, "I'll be a man"? There we go. There's a man. But it specifically went into detail. It said he formed him out of the dust of the earth. He took dirt and made him, and then breathed in him the breath of life. It made him different from any creature in heaven. It made him different from any creature on the earth, because man had a connection with this earth. He's part of this earth, but he had a connection with God. He's part of heaven as well. So he's all of a sudden, he's a different type of being than all the rest of them. And when you look at that, we can see why God tells him to have dominion and to rule, is because he's different. He's a God-like being in that respect, in a physical body that was created out of this earth. Different than anything that we know of that had been created up to this time. And people say, it gets back to the thing, is there life on other planets? I have no idea. Could there be? Could be. And they say, well, why is it mentioned in the Bible if it is? I said, because the Bible was written for us here on the earth. It's not concerned with anybody out there in some other universe or some galaxy far, far away. It's not written to them. It's written to us, and it's written about man and our position here and why we're put here, our purpose here, and what gives us purpose. And I put man was unique, the thing I just told you about. Then Genesis 1:28, God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful, multiply, Fill the earth, subdue it, rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, and every creature that crawls on the earth. Subdue and rule was God's purpose for man. That was his purpose. That's why he was put here. He was to oversee him. You notice when it said, and we're not going to get into all this, because I don't want to get into every verse after verse after verse. But what did he do with man after he created him in this second chapter? He made the Garden of Eden for him, and he made all these trees and stuff that he said he could eat from, and all this fruit that he could eat from, and he put him in the middle of that. He said, just sit back all day, every day, kick back, eat you some fruit, and just enjoy yourself. Is that what he said? Rule and multiply. And then what did he tell him about the garden? He said he put man there to tend the garden, to take care of the garden. Now, what we'd rather do many times is just sit back and do nothing, but that's not what he did. So, let's list this. God is beyond nature. There is reality outside of nature. God is not a sexual being. All other ancient accounts of gods were. There is only one God of humanity. God represents order versus chaos. God has a special role for humans. God is moral and has a moral will. Because of all this, there's a transcendent purpose for life. If you wonder what your purpose is, you have it. Science, on the other hand, teaches none of that. Genesis 1 does not seek to teach science. It seeks to teach wisdom. Questions, comments, concerns, or complaints?